Hello, Dr. Michael Fisher here, fearologist, fear analyst. I'm really wanting to read today a bit of text that I've been writing, some original journaling, spontaneous that happened just today that got me stirred up to do this video. I also want to read a little bit of a chapter that B. Maria Kumar and I are writing on fearlessness. I'll get to that in a moment, a book. And I want to read a section of chapter 8, which I've also been just working on in the last weeks. Feels like some overlap. So the topic, if you want to pin it down, is I sort of wrote it in my journal. I think it'll be called Fear Analysis in Action. Fear analysis sounding like psychoanalysis. My variation. How to be helpful and careful at the same time in communicating and connecting and doing therapy and doing fear analysis. That's what I want to teach. That's what I am teaching. That's what I am practicing. And theorizing on that, practicing all in the same time. So it becomes a little bit of a swirl. So today is a time, if you want to listen to me, or another time you want to come back to this video, a time that you want to be sitting down, you want to be comfortable, you want to be in a quiet place, more or less. I recommend. Don't have to. And be willing to hang in on understanding fear analysis as a practice. But there'll be some theoretical threads and philosophical threads weaving through this. And if you want to even hook it to, oh, this is Dr. Fisher practicing fearlessness, not just fearless analysis or fear analysis. He's operating in a particular register of communication for, again, educational therapeutic learning, unlearning processes, all guaranteed to be unpredictable, the very definition of creativity. So this is a creative video, and at the same time a pretty deep video and some really interesting text I think you'll enjoy if you hang in with me. If you don't enjoy it, obviously, you won't enjoy it. But you can leave comments in the under the video, right? And that will be interesting for me to interact with if we choose to have that kind of conversation. So you're open and invited to join with me in fear analysis in action. Start with the dream today. After my nap, I just put down anima to soul ancestor. It's kind of a title in process. I met Shirley. She was a bit younger. Didn't totally look like her, but is still my anima, love object. And she has been in my dreams she is my cousin, and she's been in my dreams for 60 plus years. Then we are communicating in some way. And another bit older woman, but also connected, but not so related as Shirley, enters the scene. I just had this uncanny sense. It's like a veiled sense opened just now as I'm writing this dream down, that Shirley is my relation, even potential my ancestor path, a trail to, a marking to on a soul level. This really intrigues me more than ever in the moment of an extension recognition. Anyways, I'm gazing at and hearing the two of these women talking, a lot of movement, almost playfully engaging with each other. I'm quite intimate in the exchanges. However, I'm back in a third point of view in the triangle, almost watching, gazing. And the course of this communication eventually moves deeper into some sort of psychic hookup. And they are both trying to work out some connection and like even solve a problem I intuited as I'm gazing. And I just continue to gaze in carefulness and in desire. They share bits appropriately. I share bits appropriately in this exchange. But the whole thing just keeps going and going and going with a lot of jouissance, joy, and from what I can see. And then it comes to an intimate psychic confluence, and I watch them have ended that part of their processing together. And it was as if it was expected in the dream, but quite unsaid, almost psychically communicated, telepathic, that there is this moment. Okay, now, me, Michael in the dream, I am free to give my gaze, view, opinion, observation, interpretation. And I offer it directly to the two women. So they kind of settle down. I'm able to get all of their full attention to give the feedback. And what I noticed is I prefer to comment on their methodology being enacted. I said, this looks like a co-cognitive behavioral method. So based on cognitive behaviorism as a technique, right, in therapy. But it was, to me, co-constructed with the two of them. There was no expert in the room. All I was doing was reflecting back. But I know I was very involved in that, really a triad of co-inquiry, co-cognitive behaviorism, etc. But at the same time as I just said that to them, I was aware, and I woke up very quickly after that, but I was aware of this sense of, that's good, but, and they agreed, oh yeah, that's what we're doing, which was cool. I got validated, but I knew something more needed to be going on and could go on at a deeper, integral, holistic kind of approach to their therapy together and with me. I'll come back to some notes in that journaling, but I'm going to move now to chapter 8, Kumar and I. Chapter 8 is called, title of the book that we're writing is one that I came up with when he said, let's write a book. We've got a publisher interested and so on. This was a couple months ago we started, and I said, oh, well, let's do it on resistances to fearlessness. A Fearism Perspective, subtitle. And I'm not going to go into all the details of fearism, what that is. You can look on my YouTube videos. I have many talks on fearism, many talks on fearlessness, etc., and on fear. It's kind of my expertise areas. But the resistances to fearlessness really interests me because I did write a book in 2010 on the world's fearlessness teachings, a critical integral approach to fear management education of the 21st century. And that's like 11 years ago that book came out, and it was my sort of major research since 1989 on fear and fearlessness dynamics. But I was focusing on fearlessness teachings around the world, kind of a synthesis and my theorizing about that. Okay. But this book, I said, okay, 11 years later, I want to talk about the resistances to fearlessness. There are a lot of resistances I've learned about. And that's come through interactions, gazing, watching, interacting with text. People write about fearlessness and or don't write about fearlessness and ought to be, or they're sort of writing about fearlessness, but they don't use the word fearlessness. Many combinations of what intrigues me is problems of, ultimately a type of communication, so that my promotion of fearlessness in the world, this fearlessness project I have gotten myself as a life mission, that those resistances are really important to understand and theorize and philosophize about. Okay, so that's basically The focus of chapter 8, that's the context. Chapter 8 is quite well into the book. It's called Double Talking Fearlessness. I start with a little epigram at the top from the dictionary. Double talking. Deliberately evasive. Example, when you try to get a straight answer, they give you double talk. I'm going to read another part of the epigram, which is on creativity. I'm only going to read part of it by Jean Gebser. In creativity, origin is present. Creativity is not bound to space and time, and its truest effect can be found in mutation, the course of which is not continuous in time, but rather spontaneous, acausal, and discontinuous. Creativity is a visibly emerging impulse of origin, which is in turn timeless, or more accurately, before or above time and timelessness. Beautiful quote on creativity. I'm just going to start the dialogue now. We do a lot of dialoguing in Kumar and I. It ought to be stated clearly, fearlessness is not only disliked, it is ignored and denied access to philosophy in general as a discipline, and in particular the Western mind and consciousness. And similarly, fearlessness is denied adequate philosophizing because of the tendency, especially in modernity, to try to circumscribe it, as with fear, similarly, within a strictly psychological interpretation. This has led to the habit of trying to put fearlessness, into a pocket and forget about it, as if that was the end of anything really creative that can further be done with these concepts. It's a nasty habit for philosophers or anyone. I'm going to jump to a section in chapter 8 now, another piece of dialogue, and this comes after a really poignant moment, acausal, out of time, out of sync, out of predictability that happened in the dialogue and while I was typing some of the dialogue text that I have with Kumar. And of course, I'm doing all the typing of it, so I am the main author, writer of this book. But I so appreciate Kumar is there with me as a mirror and is carrying on with me and allowing me to be a little bit nuts at times and creative. So we enter a piece of the dialogue in this chapter now. I'm going to read a section where it's a slip of the tongue, I'm going to call it. Something happens in the text that's quite out of place, creates kind of a very deep conflict between him and I. So you can see I've put in a fictional component as well as we are doing really dialoguing over emails. But I also then put in some fictional work and then he comments on, he can change it if he wants. I give him that right to, but I am voicing sometimes through his character in a kind of semi-trance, dreamlike state at times when I'm writing, and that's what popped in. I can't go into the long description. It would take quite a while to talk about what happened in the text, but let me just say the text got interrupted, our conversation. And really, it interrupted so much of the whole entire book of, probably 200 pages before I get to this point of us sounding like we're agreeing and communicating really well. And isn't this book going great? And the readers are going to like it, or at least they'll be able to read it and get something from it. But again, this break, this jump, this interruption, this mutation occurred. So this is a bit sometimes after that, but I'm sort of trying to have a conversation with him about what was that just happened in the text in this kind of mutation. So I'll just pick up my voice and let's go. Here we are. A new voice entered the conversation, did you notice? I ended up typing it later in italics and gave it a wider margin in the formatting of the text as well, compared to the narrower margin of our voicing in the dialogue itself. So in effect, that was a formative move, an aesthetic literary device to show that some shift was happening and that it was more concrete and conscious. It indicates an edge appearance on the stage of out of the box, so to speak, the abnormal, from about beyond the margins of the normal, repetitive, comforting text. The new had arrived. It was a double talking text at that point, revealed, which doesn't mean that double talking has not been going on elsewhere in the book. And the dialogue and all the writing that we're doing, it just came and became undeniably obvious suddenly. That's sort of a symptom showing up itself. Asking for attention, question mark. Kumar says. What do you mean by symptom? I reply. Without sounding so clinical and therapist-like, I'm saying a clue showed up for the mystery crime that you and I have been talking about with our fearism and forensic lens on the whole dynamic of the fear and fearlessness. ... Kumar interrupts. Game? Question mark. He keeps on talking. You mean we have been in a game, Michael? A Wittgensteinian. The great postmodern philosopher argued more or less that everything going on in communications and text and culture is fundamentally a word or language game. We are using words. Seem all very clear when we use words. But what the great Wittgenstein tells us is that at the same time, like a double duty performance, there is the intricate and invisible phenomenon of words which are using us. Thus, there is no one and only absolute free agent that rationally uses words to make meaning, but the meaning of the words in language and in linguistic structures are actually making us into its pawns. It's a big game. Just as I read that, I was thinking I would add, it's a big poem. Michael responds here. Wittgenstein, Foucault, Derrida, and others of the so-called linguistic turn in philosophy really turned traditional modern philosophy upside down. Here, these philosophies were telling us that philosophy is not what it seems. It is only operating as if it is telling the truth and the whole truth. But it is it is by fact of being caught in a particular or set of language games or paradigms that philosophy is only, in some sense, repeating the form and half-baked truths of the language game and or paradigm we're using. That's why paradigm has been used a lot in our book here and in my work from the beginning. I am trying to help people see that they are in a paradigm of fear. I use capitals on that. And then, while studying my work, they are in a paradigm of fearlessness, more or less. At least that's what I argue is going on. I believe I have at least some leverage to make that claim that what is going on is going on. But of course, it is near impossible to prove to those who want empirical evidence that this is what is going on. Most just get confused quickly if you think back the patterns of discourses of the response to my book by Bruce. So earlier, him and I were talking about responses to my book, The World's Fearlessness Teachings, and how, those were ambivalent responses. So that's a couple pages there, and I'm going to now jump ahead quite a few more pages, and I'm going to get to basically a story. Yeah. So after this conversation about this mutation, as I said, this disruption in the text and our relationship, this whole section, chapter 8 is part of, just for background, it's called part 5 of the book, and it's entitled Fearlessness is as Uncanny. References to psychoanalysis, Freudian thought, and others who have written about the uncanny. Okay, so I get to a point where we've We've talked a lot about the problems of talking about fear and fearlessness in words. People reading in words, but reading within paradigms, these language games, etc. I'm not going to try to define those for you here at the moment. Back to the text. Me speaking. I wish to end the chapter now within the invoking of a literary set of devices, or simply arts, literature, film capabilities that are potentially great allies to the fearlessness project. I'm also aware such literary means may simply operate in the fear paradigm itself and reinforce that paradigm. Most do. There are, however, now and then literary works and devices that provoke enlightened discourse and move us a little along the way to better understanding resistances to fearlessness. For example, the Matrix trilogy. At one point earlier, we had talked about the Wachowski brothers sci-fi trilogy, 1999 to 2003, of which became part of my dissertation research. Keep that aside. I love the Matrix film. So I thought of the rough outline for a play script right now while I was writing about the above clue to the crime that true fearlessness is always going to expose. To better try to demonstrate, even explain what those 15 lines of disruption were about and all the dialogue that followed, him and I, it's a simple story that's on my imagination. I'm going to share it. So think of the protagonist, Dan, of this play, who moves to a new village on the outskirts in the countryside. He wants to build this new house on a small piece of land there that he purchased. Dan knows no one, and they don't know him. But he is quickly the talk of the village people as the stranger. Days of shopping for supplies in the village, talking a little with people haphazardly about his house project, and everyone seems so nice. He's starting to love people there. We watch scene after scene of Dan working alone to clear the land and start his wood and cement foundation. An enormous amount of work, but he's loving the labor of it. By the end of the day of his work, he heads back to the village to stay in a motel. Then, early each morning, he is off again to work, and the repetitive cycle repeats. One day, we see that Dan has nearly completed the foundation of his house and has put up his framing of the first wall. He goes home. He has a bad dream about the wind that blows his wall down and ruins some of the foundation. In the morning, like always, he goes back to his land and is shocked to see the wall is smashed up and fallen, along with much of his foundation. He's devastated. Looking carefully at the mess, he notices a beer can in the grass nearby. He looks for more clues. No tracks, nothing. Dan immediately knows that someone who is not supposed to be there on his property was there that night, and he begins to suspect there's something not quite right. His worst thoughts move towards fear and thinking a crime has occurred called vandalism. He has worse nightmares that night and not knowing what to do. He can't stand thinking the thought of reporting a crime and doesn't want to create a problem as he is quite a shy fellow. He keeps his mouth shut. He wants to trust. Skip now several scenes. The story unfolds that every day he fixes the house and vandalism that occurred, but it is there again the next day. He tries putting up hidden cameras at night and hides in the bushes nearby one night, but he sees nothing and ends up falling asleep. More vandalism happens, this time to his car. And it goes on. He's getting enraged with the situation and his house is not getting built. He goes to a neighbor and asks if they have seen any unusual signs around as strangers, potential vandals, and he finally tells them that he's experienced this vandalism on his house. The neighbors appear to be listening, but do not register a thing, he said, about the vandalism. They talk in ways that make Dan feel like he is hallucinating. He's deeply troubled by troubling them and then becomes to question his own insanity. Turns out he cannot talk to them about vandals or vandalism because everyone, included the people in the town he tries to mention it to, don't understand the term apparently. They always give what Dan says to them around the crime events on his land a completely different meaning to it. At some points, Dan is repeatedly shaking his head and is talking to them, not to be seen as rude in regard to their responses. It was merely that he was trying to shake things around in his head to find out an order for making sense that was effective with them. But it never happened. He couldn't communicate with them. Writing in his motel room one night, journaling in the midst of this and a storm outside, he wrote by candlelight, quote, "The term seems to have disappeared from their vocabulary." Then he paused and wrote, quote, "Today the village psychiatrist approached me and said, 'You should get your head injury looked at.' And she smiled and walked away. It took me a few moments to figure out that she was talking about my constantly shaking my head in disbelief about the people here. In my growing paranoia, I knew she had the power to put me in a mental institute for having a disturbed, injured head. It's called a mental disorder. This is really freaking me out." End quote from his journal. After coming to terms with struggling thoughts in his mind for days as to whether he should just get the hell out of this place and sell his land, or he should fight back, the decision came to dig in with both heels. He starts doing research on any clues as to how this ignorance happened in this whole town, village. What could be so universal that it has brought about this strange behavior pattern, he asked. Another late night, when he couldn't sleep and drank a bit too much wine, he falls out of his bed accidentally and starts shaking uncontrollably for several minutes. Eventually calming himself down a bit, he grabs his journal and wrote, quote, "What are they all so afraid of?" Question mark. End of quote. The story gets complex far beyond the scope of my short telling of the tale here, but the point is that he now has a different problem on his hands than what has been happening to his house night after night. He is now tracking a much more serious problem regarding the erasure of vandalism from the village. It's the problem that obsesses him. I won't give away the answer and the arc of that story because hopefully you'll read it in my book or you can ask me questions about it. Um, he gets into an interesting situation. So just a one little theme there within also the way I practice fear analysis is, which I think is like practicing really good deep psychotherapy, is to always question the problem and the problem with the problem. That the problem that's presenting may not be the problem that needs to be solved. Now apply that to research and teaching about fear and fearlessness. Instead of using the word vandalism, I'm implying here, if you haven't picked it up already, that vandalism in that story of Dan, in that fictional scene, is a little bit like me and Kumar trying to teach or talk about fearlessness that's going on and the village people, the town. So the analogy, the world, for the most part, seems not able to communicate in the way they need to be communicated to, and I have to figure out how to do that. Again, kind of like even in my dream after the nap, I was trying to be this triangular positioning on what was happening with these two women in a communicative therapeutic learning experience they were having that was beneficial to them. I haven't always figured out how to do that with the word fearlessness. the concept fearlessness, even though I've been teaching it for 31 years. Yeah. Um, that's a lot what this book is about, these resistances to fearlessness. How and why do they show up? And how can I analyze that from a fearlessness paradigm itself on the problem of fearlessness, just like the word vandalism. What happens if it's not part of the language game? Okay, won't go into that in super detail, but I want to probably pick up some notes here. These are after my dream, reflecting that one of the terms I use a lot in my work, and it's a place that I pretty quickly get off the groove from virtually everybody that I try to communicate with. And I try to do this very technical, philosophically, professionally, sometimes just playfully as a creative artist type person and so on. But I get off groove with a lot of people because I use the term fear problem. So fear problem would be just in simple language. Oh, Michael, you're talking about a category of a problem that's related to fear, right? Oh, this is a type of fear problem. And I say, well, that's partly what I'm talking about, but I'm actually talking about capital F, capital P. And I even say the fear problem. Now, I've got another book underway right now called The Fear Problematique. And one of the reasons I used the word problematique, I was trying to get, I'm going to be talking about the fear problem in educational philosophy. That's the title of that book that's coming next, among others, is that the fear problem gets coded in ways that I don't always like the habit of how it gets coded. As if, oh, you're talking about problems to do with fear, which I am, and that is not what I'm talking about. It's just like Dan trying to talk about, well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. There's actually damage going on to my house, the foundation I'm trying to build. Well, and I'm saying there's actually damage going on to the foundations of the philosophy of fearlessness, which I'm trying to teach, which then can be indicative of and a leading to and a guide for understanding fear and fearlessness relationship much better than we do now. And you can hear where I'm going. So, but the words, the fear problem, which I've used so much in my text, I still feel people can virtually ignore what I talk about as the fear problem, capital F, capital P. And as many times as I've tried to define it and put it in all kinds of ways, no comprehende, apparently. But that is related to, the practice of fear analysis, trying to understand that very fear problem and communicating from small f p, understanding of categorical problems to do with fear, and the fear problem. So I'm trying even a third technique with a bit of a twist in the language, the fear problematique, in that next book. So keep you informed on that as we go down that book. All right, so here's just another example I put about, here's one of the problems with focus and non-focus. So this is part of how I do fear analysis, and obviously I'm teaching people, if you want to learn fear analysis, there's manuals I have created, little ones, nothing sort of official and big and fine detail, but I have done writing about fear analysis, a guide to. But the problem of focus and unfocus, so when you put a word down, just thinking on paper, right, like in the chapter with Kumar, we're writing down the word fearlessness, and it's like I start to become aware as we're having the conversation. It is so easy to not be with those people that, and those words that actually mean something that they don't mean on paper. Okay, what do I mean by that? The problem is when you put the word down, and I could use the words, let's just say ecstatic or sexual. You write the word down, and it's just how those words are so particular and focused because the letters are focused. And yet, it is not the focus that I, as I'm just going to say, as a therapist, as a fear analyst, actually want the focus to be on. So I have to write a word in focus, right? Focus, there's the word. We all recognize it if you can spell and read in English. That very clarity of its own focus, of its own taking place on the page, taking place in our mind, in that clarity of its own words, letters, is actually distractive and part of the problem, which will resist and act as a resistance to the actual discovering of the fearlessness that I'm attempting to teach or have unveiled as even an emergent awareness. Not that there's only one way to think about what is fearlessness and what is it. That also becomes a problematic search, trying to pin it down to one static thing, and then you got it, you grab it, put it in your pocket. That's all part of the problem. So I'm looking for how to get something that's so in focus, let's just say the word ecstatic, and try to get it so it has non-focus. Well, you could squint your eyes down, you could just listen to the word, and that might help. That might be really useful, just the same with word fearlessness. So that's a possibility of this moving beyond the clarity focus approach to understanding. So I called it the tyranny of focus, and how once you get a tyranny of focus on a term, like let's just use ecstatic, could be fearlessness, could be vandalism, that then that focus will actually distract you away from the phenomenon itself that is attempting to be spoken of or written of, about, and communicated, obviously, so we can have exchange and grow together in that exchange and develop the exchange and develop our understanding of fearlessness ultimately, for example, or the ecstatic. So I was just saying, how do we blur, when we use language, how do we get the blur? And that's what we have to probably do by being able to attune to our subtle, you could call it intuition, perceptiveness, could even be telepathic capability of communicating and connecting with when that word goes down. Let's just call it ecstatic. We're looking at the space around, in and behind and above, as well as the resistances to the understanding of ecstatic, and therefore we require more holistic gestalt-like perceptivity and attuning to our own antenna. I like the term Broca and I'll let your psychoanalyst artist uses, called the erotic antenna that we have as human beings, just like the child has for the mother in the womb and the mother has for the child in the womb, even though they don't see each other, right? There's no focus for each other for that relational I, and yet to be I or a non-I as the fetus in the womb. But she says, and I agree, matrixial theory says that there's an immense erotic set of antenna developed between them. There has to be, for ensuring survival, and that is like billions of years old, perhaps at least hundreds of millions of years old, in that mammal relationship of mother parent to the womb, and what's in the womb growing, and how they have to make an attunement. Well, they're sharing the same blood system, oxygen systems, and so on. They're pretty intimately in connection. And the erotic antenna, she says, are still there after we are birthed. As adults right now, we have these erotic antennae for connectivity. That goes back to my original dream of these two women connecting in these very interesting ways. I was connecting across a distance and gaze with them, and we were having a really intense interaction. I can't even put it in words how intimate it was. Based upon these erotic antennae of intensity to be in a caring relationship. And with that, the originary compassion that Brock Edger talks about. And that is ultimately what fearlessness is involved in, to go back to it, or even the experience of the ecstatic. Again, Now I can start talking about those terms, ecstatic and fearlessness. You can start creating images within particular language games and paradigms for that. But I'm always going to then ask, as I do in the book and in much of my writing and teaching, what are we now trying to make the connection with those words, those concepts, those communications going on within a fear paradigm or a fearlessness paradigm? And then what is the relationship between a fear paradigm and a fearlessness paradigm? When does one become one or the other? Or how do they slide and move along each other? There's still a lot to be explored in that. Don't have all the answers. But I'm pushing people philosophically, theoretically, and through practices of even Fearanalysis, for example. It's not the only practice by any means that's useful here, but it's a major one. Fearanalysis is, and you can see I'm just digging always deeper into these fuzzy zones, the blurry zones, out of focus from what is in focus, the word fearlessness itself, for example. So I think the title of that book, I'll probably wrap this up now, is that I'm putting out with Kumar is, I think it's going to be a pretty powerful book. So it's a little bit of promotion to prep you for it. That it will be unlike any book I've ever seen written by human beings that I know of. And I've been researching this for 31 years, seeing what people write and think about, teach about fear and fearlessness, that this will be quite a unique entree to a different way of thinking in those zones in between, right? The fuzzy, blurry, out of focus zones. Even though there's going to be some really straight up, reasoning and logic and arguments and empirical evidence, or that's all in our dialogue as well. But what's most exciting is to be able to do this in a dialogical voice with someone, so that you are the reader listening to a conversation, even though it's a kind of a fictional, non-fictional conversation. And today, what I wanted to show is that somehow all of these things that I've given you on this video, from my dream to the reading to an outline for a play script in that chapter 8 to now this bit of discussion in my notes, just touching on some kind of threads of really, it's a collage of things, happenings. This is somewhat real, but we also know it's virtual. What's real, what's fictional. But there is some kind of teaching and listening and reflecting and mirroring going on. And I think it will be useful, at least for you, to start to understand what fear analysis in action might start to look like. One variation, this video. Again, look forward to conversations with you. See you soon.